On the frontier, the water people were relieved to find killed more of them than the water they never found. The real killer was riding inside water that looked completely safe, and almost nobody could see it coming until it was already too late. I'll tell you the one simple habit that protected the men who made it through. And most of them had no idea it was the reason they were still alive. I'm Cole Hartwell. I've spent more than 50 years in the backcountry, and 19 winters of that alone. So when I tell you the old fear was pointed at the wrong thing, I'm not guessing. I paid for this. The fatal habit was not running dry. It was drinking whatever water sat in front of you, especially the still stagnant water that looked the cleanest. There was no way of knowing it was carrying death you couldn't see, smell, or taste. I know that cuts against the old story. The old hands get credit for knowing the land better than anyone, and mostly they earned it. But on this one point, that natural instinct got a lot of careful, capable men killed. Drink what's in front of you when you're thirsty, if it looks clean. That was the whole rule. I'd rather you know the truth of it than believe a comfortable version of the past that isn't true. Picture the actual moment instead of the myth. A man kneels at a pool ringed with grass, the water flat and clear enough to see the bottom. No smell to it, nothing crawling on the surface. Every sense he has tells him this is safe. That's the whole problem. His senses were built to catch a bad smell or a bad taste. They were never built to catch a threat too small to see. And this particular threat never once tripped a warning he knew to look for. Here's what makes it worse. It wasn't the reckless men or the fools who paid for this the hardest. It was the same instinct sitting in every man alike, careful or careless, because a still pool gives a careful man no warning any different from the warning it gives a fool. Roughly, 1 in 10 people who set out on the westward trails in the worst of those years never finished the trip. Look at why they died, and disease is the answer by a wide margin, far ahead of accidents, animal attacks, or any kind of violence along the way. That single fact ought to reward everything you thought you knew about the dangers of that country. One disease in particular did more of this killing than every other disease on the frontier combined. Once you understand what it was and how fast it worked, you will never look at a quiet, clear pool of water the same way again. The disease was cholera, and the trail records are plain. Cholera caused more illness and death on the emigrant trails than every other sickness combined. It didn't come from bad luck or spoiled food. It came from a bacteria that thrives in water forled by waste. That's the kind of water that sits still in a low spot and looks perfectly calm and perfectly clear on top. Here's the part that ought to sit wrong with you. Cholera did not work slow. It attacked the gut fast and hard, hitting a man with violent diarrhea, vomiting and cramps that could double him over inside hours of that first drink. The dehydration it caused could turn a man's skin dry, tight, and dark toward blue. In that same short stretch of time, a man could wake up feeling fine, drink from a still pool at breakfast, and be dead and in the ground by nightfall. And that's not an exaggeration for effect. Cholera could kill in as little as 12 hours from the first cramp. With no treatment for it out on that trail, a man's odds ran out fast once the sickness took hold. That's what the record shows, over and over. Across the trail, years, not a rare horror story, a routine one. A woman named Cecilia Adams kept a diary crossing that same country in 1852. And her entries read like a body count. Past 7 new-made graves, she wrote one day. One had 4 bodies in it. Cholera. A few days later, she counted 21 new-made graves in a single stretch, then 13 more. Then 10 more after that. That's not a haunted house story meant to spook you. That's one woman's plain diary entry from a road she actually walked, written down the same evening she passed those graves. The worst years for this were 1849 and 1850. The trails were packed tighter than they had ever been, and the waste from thousands of travelers and their animals had nowhere to go but into the same water everyone was drinking from. In 1849 alone, cholera is believed to have killed something like 5,000 people on the trail that year. That same year, more than 4,000 people died of it back in St. Louis, the jumping-off point. Half those travelers had just left behind. The sickness didn't wait for a man to get out into open country. It was already riding with him before he ever cleared the settlements. The numbers from that stretch are hard to look at straight on. Estimates for the years 1849 through 1855 put cholera deaths on the overland trails somewhere between 6,000 and 12,500 people. That comes out to roughly 3 out of every 100 people who set out on that road. Disease of every kind, cholera chief among it, accounted for the large majority of all the deaths that happened along the way. Those numbers land a little after the fur trade's own peak years. So I want to be straight with you. This is the record of the frontier and the westward trails broadly. Not one single decade of trapping alone, but the water that carried it never checked a calendar. The danger sat the same for anyone drinking from the wrong pool at the wrong time. Trapper or wagon train family alike. Think about what that means for a man's plans. You can plan around a grizzly. You can post a guard, carry a rifle, hang your meat high and go to sleep knowing you did what you could. You can't plan around a threat that looks exactly like relief, sitting right there in a low spot of ground, waiting on you to kneel down and drink. Cholera never worked alone. The same fouled water, the same low pools sitting near a camp or a trail crossing, carried dysentery and typhoid right alongside it. Both spread the identical way. Water tainted by human and animal waste that had no business being anywhere near a drinking hole. Where cholera killed fast, these two wore a man down slower, over days instead of hours, draining him with fever and gut sickness until his body simply had nothing left to fight with. Typhoid set a man's temperature climbing for days on end, wearing his strength down bit by bit instead of dropping him in an afternoon. Dysentery tore at the gut with a bloody, unrelenting sickness that could leave a strong man too weak to walk beside his own wagon. Neither one announced itself any louder than cholera did. They came from the exact same mistake, drinking water that looked fine. And they killed by that identical means filth riding invisible in water that gave no sign of it. Dysentery got so common on those trails that it turned into a kind of dark joke among the travelers themselves. The same line people still repeat today about dying of dysentery on the way west. That joke only works because the real thing was everywhere. Common enough and expected enough that immigrants had a sore fan for it before they had even packed their wagons. A sickness doesn't earn a place in the folklore of an entire generation by being rare. It earns that place by being the thing nearly every family on that road had already buried someone to, long before they ever reached the country they set out for. Stack all three together, cholera, dysentery, and typhoid, and you get the actual shape of the frontier's real killer. Not one freak sickness that caught a few unlucky souls, a pattern built directly into the water itself, sitting and waiting in nearly every still pool a traveler might kneel down at. It was patient in a way no animal or storm ever had to be. The same pattern holds for the men who didn't ride wagons at all. And here is where it stops being a story about wagon trains. It starts being a story about your own trade. Because the water that carried this danger for every kind of traveler was also the exact water a mountain man built his whole living around. A trapper did not stumble onto bad water by accident, the way a wagon family passing through once might. He waded into it every single day of his working season, because the beaver streams that made his living were the same streams he filled his cup from. For the old hands who worked a line, a beaver stream was a workplace and a water source rolled into one, and there was no clean way to separate the two. There's a real sickness tied to this, and it's called beaver fever, That name comes from a real cause, not a campfire tale. Beaver fever is giardia, a parasite that lives in the gut of an infected animal and gets shed out into the surface water around it. Beavers are a documented source of exactly this. Researchers tracing outbreaks of giardia in drinking water have gone as far as TARAPPP beavers straight out of a contaminated watershed. They confirmed those animals carried a strain of the parasite strong enough to sicken test animals in a lab. The beaver itself was doing real work spreading the sickness, and the water sitting near it was only carrying what the animal put there. Picture what that means for a man setting his line of first light. He wades a cold stream to check a trap, cups a drink from that same stream because it's right there, and easier than carrying a full skin all day. The very animal he's there to catch has already loaded that water with the thing that's about to take him off his feet, the fur that paid his way for the season, and the sickness that could end his season. Both came out of the same stretch of water on the same morning. He had no way of telling one from the other by looking. That same stream did more than fill his cup. He used it to cook his meals, to work the flesh off a fresh hide, to wash the blood and grease off his hands at the end of a long day. The exposure was not one drink taken carelessly. It was constant contact with the same water from sunup to sundown, day after day. For the whole length of a trapping season, a wagon family might pass a bad pull once and keep moving. A trapper lived on top of his. I want to be fair about what this sickness actually does, because I would rather you trust me than be impressed by a scarier story than the truth deserves. Giardia doesn't usually kill a man the way cholera does. It's a slow, grinding sickness, cramping that won't quit, weight dropping off a man who can't keep food down, an exhaustion that hangs on for weeks instead of hours. It could put a strong trapper flat on his back for the exact stretch of season when his line needed checking every single day. It cost men their season a lot more often than it cost them their life. And out here, losing a season could cost a man plenty on its own, without ever needing to take him all the way. Here is the cruelest part of the whole arrangement. The very water a trapper trusted the most, because it looked wild, clean, and untouched by any town, wagon camp, or livestock herd, was sometimes the most lauded water on the whole frontier. That was precisely because of the animal he had come there to catch. Nobody could see that coming. To a man standing on that creek bank, clear water was safe water. Full stop. And that was not foolishness on his part. That was the best information anybody alive at the time actually had, because the science that would have told him different simply did not exist yet. Germ theory, the idea that tiny living things too small to see could cause disease, did not take hold in medicine until sometime in the 1860s through the 1880s. That's decades after the worst years on the frontier trails had already come and gone. A doctor named John Snow in London had traced a cholera outbreak back to a single contaminated water pump on Broad Street in 1854. But that clue has sat mostly ignored for another 30 years. Robert Koch's government sent him chasing a cholera outbreak in Alexandria, Egypt, in the summer of 1883. But that one ran its course before he had his answer. He followed a second and worse outbreak to Calcutta, India, and it was there, on the Ganges River, that he finally isolated the exact organism responsible. Not until early in 1884, that happened more than 3 decades after the worst cholera years on the American trails, and half a world away from any man kneeling at a Rocky Mountain creek. None of that reached a trapper or an emigrant decades earlier. It hadn't been discovered yet. By anybody, anywhere on Earth. Before any of that science existed, the leading medical belief of the day was that disease traveled through bad air, a theory doctors called MISMA, not through water at all. That means nobody standing at a clear pool had any real reason to suspect the water itself. Suspicion pointed at fog, at swamp air, at the smell of a low, damp place, at anything except the one thing that was actually doing the killing right under everyone's nose. That's the trap in full, plain and complete. Clearwater looked safe because looking safe was the only test anybody had. A stagnant pool with no smell and no color passed that test every single time, right up until the moment it did not, and by then it was already too late to matter. The West added a second trap on top of the first one. In some stretches, out through the Great Basin, the long dry country crossing Wyoming, natural springs ran heavy with alkaline and saline salts, souring the water even when no sickness was riding in it at all. Water that wasn't carrying disease could still leave a man sick, weak and cramping from the minerals alone. Livestock died at some of those same springs. Travelers who drank there got just as sick as they would have from a fouled pool 100 miles back, for a reason that had nothing to do with waste or bacteria at all. A traveler couldn't tell the difference by looking at either kind. Two completely different dangers, one built from filth, one built from minerals in the ground itself. Both wore the same disguise of a clear, harmless-looking drink, and a man had no eye instrument out there that could tell him which one he was kneeling in front of. Here is the part I want to leave you with, before we get to what actually worked. The men who died this way were not the careless ones, and they were not the fools either. They were often the same steady, sensible men who did everything right by every standard anyone had at the time. Men who read the land well, and still knelt at the wrong pool. The information that would have saved them simply didn't exist yet in their lifetime. That's a harder thing to sit with than blaming bad judgment. But it's the truth of it. Here is what I want you to take from all of this, because knowing the danger without knowing the fix does a viewer no good at all. The men who survived this stretch of frontier history were not smarter about germs than anyone else standing next to them. They simply landed on a handful of habits that happened to work, even without ever knowing the real reason why they worked. Choosing moving water over still water, whenever a man had the choice, was the habit that mattered most. Drawing from a running spring or a flowing creek instead of a quiet pool sitting off to the side. Moving water doesn't give waste a place to settle and build up the way a still pool does. So even without a lick of germ theory in his head, a man who favored the running water over the quiet pool was cutting his risk by a wide margin. Without ever knowing the exact reason, he couldn't have explained why a fast riffle over gravel was safer than a flat grassy pool if you had asked him. But the men who lived by that rule anyway outlasted the ones who never bothered to notice the difference. My grandfather Amos had that rule, and he never told me the reason behind it, just which water to trust and which to leave alone. He learned it from the men who came before him, and they learned it the same way, knowledge passing hand to hand, without anyone ever knowing why it worked. Picking your spot on the water mattered just as much as picking the water itself. The old hands who lived through this learned to camp and drink upstream of the wagons, the livestock, and anything dead lying nearby, because water always carries whatever is fouling it downstream to whoever drinks from it next. Camp above the mess instead of below it, and you're drinking that water before any of the filth downstream ever reaches you, not after. It sounds almost too simple to matter. That's exactly why so many men skipped it, since the easiest camp spot was rarely the one furthest upstream from everybody else. But the single best habit of the bunch was boiling the water before anyone put it to their lips. Heat kills what the eye can't see, whether the man doing the boiling understood bacteria or not. That one simple step turned a gamble into something close to a sure thing. It cost a man nothing but a little time and a fire he likely already had burning. Boring is what surviving actually looks like. A pot of coffee boiled hot in the morning did more to protect a man's life that day than any rifle he carried. He never had to know a single thing about germs to get the benefit of it. I will give you the honest limit of all three, because I would rather you trust me than be impressed by a claim that oversells it. None of these three habits could touch the alkaline and saline springings that soured water with minerals instead of sickness. Boiling that water only concentrates the salt instead of removing it. A man still had to learn which springs to avoid entirely, usually the hard way. The same way he learned everything else out here. No fire and no clever camp placement fixes a problem sitting in the ground itself instead of riding in on filth, and pretending otherwise would have gotten a man just as sick as never boiling anything at all. That's the honest shape of it. 3 simple habits handled the disease side of the danger about as well as anything could without a microscope. No one of them touched the mineral side at all, which meant a sharp man still needed to know both problems existed and treat them as 2 separate fights, not one. Put those 3 habits together anyway. And here is the rule that falls out of them, plain and simple. On the frontier, the safest assumption a man could make was that every still, clear pool he found was trying to kill him until he had proven otherwise with his own hands and his own fire. That was not a comfortable way to live, and it was not easy to keep up day after day on a hard crossing. But the men who kept that rule saw a lot more winters than the men who simply trusted their eyes instead. So the fear was pointed at the wrong door. Men crossed that country dreading a dry canteen when the real danger waited in the water they were relieved to find. More frontiersmen died with a full canteen of the wrong water than an empty one ever managed alone. Tell me down in the comments which of these old rules you had already heard. If you want more of this, subscribe and follow along. Next time I'm covering what mountain men actually ate through a hard winter, why it wasn't what most people picture, and why some of those food choices killed a man just as surely as the water did. Until then, trust the water that moves, doubt the water that